In 1986, after a 2-year investigation, the Italian government decided to prosecute several high-ranking members of the Sicilian Mafia. One of those members was a man named Bernardo Provenzano, who was suspected of being the head of the Mafia at that point in time. He had been involved with the organization since the 1950s, and by the 1980s, he'd risen to the very top of it. It was actually his capture in 1993 that led to this major trial. There was so much evidence against him. In fact, there was literally hundreds of testimonies from various Mafia turncoats, also known as pentiti, along with loads of wiretap evidence. All of this resulted in 457 years of prison sentences for him alone. The trial was very public, attracting tons of media attention. And although many of the Mafia bosses were able to flee Italy and hide, Provenzano was not one of them. He knew that he would be hunted down if he tried to escape, so he remained in Italy. But it turned out that, even though all the evidence was stacked against him, his lawyers were still able to get most of the charges dropped due to a lack of evidence. They even managed to get the ones that remained heavily reduced. This meant that instead of spending the rest of his life in prison, Provenzano only had to spend 26 years in prison. He was actually released in 2010, but he died from cancer just a few years later. But whilst he was inside, one strange thing happened that made him quite possibly the most powerful Mafia boss of all time. Something so strange that when it was revealed, the whole world was shocked. It started like any other day in prison. In the morning, Provenzano would wake up, eat breakfast, maybe do some cleaning duties, then come back in the afternoon to eat some more food before going back to his cell for the night. His cell, however, wasn't exactly a normal prison cell. It didn't have a bed or a desk or anything like that. It was totally bare, apart from a small slot where he could put food. You see, as a higher-ranking member of the Mafia, Provenzano was extremely feared. As such, no prisoner wanted to share a cell with him. This meant that he spent almost every waking hour of his life completely alone. There was one occasion, though, where someone did share a cell with him. It was only for 3 days, but it was enough time for that person to send shockwaves around the entire world. That guy's name was Matteo, and he was also a Mafia boss. Now, unlike Provenzano, Matteo was actually able to get away with his crimes. He was on the run from the police for almost 30 years. However, in 2013, he was finally caught and sent to prison. Because he was a Mafia boss, they put him in the same prison as Provenzano. They didn't put him in the same cell, but they did put him in the same prison. And that meant that every day Provenzano would go to the cafeteria and sit next to Matteo. These two men had never met before, but they both knew who the other was. They also both knew that eventually they'd end up in the same cell, which is why on the third day something very strange happened. After lunch, when the two of them were heading back to their respective cells, Matteo stopped in his tracks. He then turned to Provenzano and handed him a piece of paper. It was blank. It had no words written on it. Yet somehow Provenzano understood what it meant, and he knew exactly what to do. After getting back to his cell, he took the blank sheet of paper and crumpled it up into a tiny ball. He then put it right into the top corner of the food slot. Now normally, food would come through this hole, but because the paper was so small, it fit perfectly in the gap, blocking it completely. This meant that whenever anyone came to bring Provenzano his dinner, they would simply have to leave it outside the cell door. Then, once they'd gone, Provenzano would come out, grab the food, and go back into his cell. It sounds stupid, but this is exactly how the Mafia operates. If anyone ever got given a piece of paper with something written on it, they would know that it was a message. Because of this, they can communicate without anyone knowing about it. It's exactly what happened here. The note may have been blank, but it was clear that it was a message. This meant that anyone receiving a note has to respond back with another note. This is the only way that they can communicate. And this is the only way that they can pass on information. Now you might think, well, why don't they just write things on the paper? Surely that's easier than passing around a blank piece of paper. Well, the reason is because the Mafia has strict rules about writing things down. If anyone gets caught with anything written on it, they're immediately killed. It's that serious. Even if you wrote down your grocery list, you'd be dead within seconds. That's how secret everything has to be. So if they can't write something, then the only other way they can communicate is orally, but this is obviously not ideal. You never know who might be listening in. Can't trust anyone. And that's why the blank piece of paper is so important. It sends a message without actually sending a message. And as you can probably guess, the Mafia are very particular about this. There's a special meaning behind each and every single blank piece of paper. And in order to properly understand it, you need to be inducted into the Mafia. But let me tell you anyway. A single sheet of paper means something different to a torn-up piece of paper. Same goes for how the paper is folded. For example, if the paper is folded in half, it means something else entirely. If the paper is rolled up, it means something else again. On top of this, there's even more codes. How the paper is passed is also important. If the paper is slid under a door, it means something different to having the paper thrown at someone. These are just some examples. And there are tons more. Basically, the Mafia use these blank pieces of paper like it's Morse code. Each piece of paper is a message in itself. And in order to understand it, you need to know the secret code words. Obviously, nobody outside the Mafia knows these codes, which is why the world was shocked when they found out about the blank piece of paper. Once the blank piece of paper had been passed to Provenzano, he responded back with a folded piece of paper. It was the signal that he'd received the message. When Mateno received it, he then wrote down a few words and passed it on to another Mafia boss called Lattimore, who had been hiding in Brazil for years. Lattanzio was actually caught a year later and returned to Italy, where he revealed everything. He told the police about the blank piece of paper and how it was used to communicate messages. He also told them that this is how the Mafia was still able to operate while many of their high-ranking members were inside prison. This revelation completely shocked the police. They'd never heard of this before. They had not even considered that the Mafia could be communicating with each other using blank pieces of paper. To them it sounded crazy, but it was true. And they soon figured out that the message that had been passed between Matenu and Lattanzio had been about a plan to murder a judge who was due to testify against them in court. Thankfully, the police were able to stop the assassination attempt. And ever since then, they've been on the lookout for any blank pieces of paper being passed around. As you can imagine, though, it's pretty hard to catch someone passing a blank piece of paper. They can easily pretend that it's just a piece of paper. It's not like the police can barge into someone's house and ask them, "Hey, can I see what you're doing with that piece of paper?" Anyway, now you know why it's so important that prisoners don't receive any blank pieces of paper. But do you know what else is super important? Subscribing if you haven't done that already. That's all for this video, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to subscribe so you can catch every new video that we drop. Also, check out the links in the description. We've got some cool merch over there. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.